While on patrol, my partner and I received a call about someone standing on a ledge at the top of a building. We got there as soon as we could and met the fire trucks. It was a tall building, 40 stories, so we looked at her through binoculars. A woman stood with her back to the ledge, ankles just hanging over, and she stared at something. We tried to look and see if another person was with her, but it didn't appear so. By now, a crowd had gathered, and a team had been sent up the building to talk her down. Someone was using a megaphone to talk to her, but she still didn't seem to hear it, still looking onto the building top. We even tried to have the woman's boyfriend talk to her through the megaphone, but she remained unresponsive. I heard that the team reached the roof, but the door was locked, and I watched through the binoculars as they rammed the steel door down, and her feet left the ledge, but instead of falling, for a moment, she hung in the air, and to me it looked like someone held her from the collar of her sweatshirt, and then she fell. The crowd was mortified when I started asking around if anyone had noticed her hanging in the air for that single moment. No one saw it, and the team which went to the rooftop said no one else was on the roof. When we inspected the body, we found a strange carving carved into her inner thigh. It was ruled a suicide, but in my gut, I don't think it was. Her facial expression was one of fear, not one of pain. One shift I'd been making my way back to the station, about to finish out my day, when a domestic violence call came in. It was close to where I was, so myself and one other car responded. The call claimed that a man was beating his wife in the front yard and appeared to be either drunk or on drugs. We came in hot, and the man didn't stop pummeling his defenseless wife, so we approached him with guns drawn. At the sight of us, he grabbed his wife and held her up as a body shield while we backed up to his house. We tried to talk him out of it, but he entered the house, and I told the other patrolmen to call in backup while I side-skirted the house. I could see inside, and the man had let his wife go, but he pushed her towards a stairway. Though it was against my training, it got me in a lot of trouble later. I entered the house and followed the couple into the basement. I heard the woman pleading for her life, asking not to be fed to it. I rushed down, and when the man turned on me with a gun in his hand, I fired twice, and each shot went through his chest. The woman fled, and I noticed a massive hole in the center of the floor. I looked in, and it appeared to be about 30 feet deep. And at the bottom, it led to a tunnel, and a fiery glow came from it. Vicious growling echoed from the tunnel, and I left the house. When I asked the woman what was down in the hole, she only laughed at me, and then the paramedics took her away. When they sent a camera down the hole, they found nothing, just that it seemed to be the start of a well. I'd only been a homicide detective for a few months when I arrived at the location of a recent found body. It was at a cemetery, and the call had been made by a few teenagers. They were honest with us and told us that they'd snuck out to come smoke cigarettes in the cemetery when they found the freshly dug sites, which had odd blood and pus trails to them. The uniforms had gotten a hold of the owner, who came out and claimed that no one should be buried in that part of the cemetery. We dug it up and found 3 girls that we'd been searching for weeks. They'd gone far into the decomposition process, but it was still clear as day that they were the same girls. Same clothes they went missing in was the first detail, but I'll spare the rest. After we took all the pictures that we needed, we turned away for a moment to have a few drags off of the smoke. And when we glanced back, one of the bodies was gone. Now, frantically, we searched the area, convinced that the murderer was still in the area. A search around led us to nothing, but when we returned, a second body had been removed from the group. Now I stayed with the final body, and told the others to spread out the search, and I radioed in for more people to secure the area. Over the radio, they claimed that they couldn't find anything. And I thought at that moment that I heard something, and it drew my attention away from the corpse for only a second, very briefly. And when I turned, was when I heard the sound of movement of water. I cursed myself for being so stupid, because a small decorative pond was near where we were standing. Someone was stealing the bodies right from under our noses, and they were using the pond. So I sprinted over and dived into it. It was dark and murky, and I grew frightened when I saw the body bending and moving to pull itself along the bottom of the pond. When everyone returned, I told them what I saw. And when we checked again in the pond, it was empty. Now, the others chalked it up to me being incredibly tired, but I know what I saw. Those bodies moved themselves. They didn't want to be found. As an EMT, I got pregnant women going into labor calls all the time. But one time I saw the most unnatural birth. We'd picked this woman up around 9 o'clock at night from a restaurant. She'd been in labor for a while, so we raced her toward the hospital while I prepared myself to deliver a baby. She wasn't going to make it to the hospital, so I told the driver to pull over and help me deliver the baby safely. Now, everything seemed normal at first. The woman did everything we asked, and I was ready to do something I'd never done before. The head started to crown, and my coworker and I glanced at one another once we noticed the skin seemed scaly. We both ignored it, thinking that it was some sort of rare medical condition. And then the head came completely out, and I jumped back. It seemed like a snake's head was emerging from the woman. She noticed our reactions and stood up, then pulled every monitoring cord from her and her IV. Now, we tried to convince her to lay back down, but nothing worked, and she awkwardly walked to the back of the ambulance and pushed the doors open. She glanced back at us before she jumped down and ran into the woods. Now, me and the other EMT remained frozen for a minute before we searched for the woman. We never found her and never heard anything of her again. Of course, the name she'd given us was fake. Springtime usually was pretty slow being a firewoman. People stopped using their heaters as much, and the weather brought plenty of rain. We were driving around more just for something to do, and we got a call to go 5 blocks from our current position. In the city, it's kind of hard to see the smoke of fires, but when we turned a corner, we could see smoke filling the sky like an angry storm, and the tips of the flames reaching up past the other buildings. We geared up in record time, and when we pulled up, we immediately sprang into action. The fire encompassed 4 buildings and several other fire departments began showing up. People still ran out of the buildings, so myself and a few others put on our oxygen tanks and masks. Then, with an axe in hand, we entered the least flame-infested building. Inside, we shouted for people to start making their way towards our voices, for them to stay low or to call out if they needed help. And one sound caught my attention over the crackling wood. A little girl's crying. I followed down a long hall and opened the doors at the end. The room was engulfed in flames, and I could feel the blast of heat even through my equipment. When I stopped, I heard someone chuckling from inside the room. I rose and peered into the room. It was empty, and the roof devoured by flames. As I went to meet up with the others, I heard the crying once again, and I thought it might be a trick of the mind, but it wouldn't go away. It sounded so real. The door closed to the room where I thought I heard the girl crying. It wouldn't budge, so I hit it with an axe a couple times and I entered. And there, a little girl lay on the floor, sobbing with flames burning through the walls of her bedroom. I picked her up and crouched low so she'd be lower than the smoke, and she coughed for a moment, then leaned in and whispered into my ear. "What about him?" I looked back and scanned her room, and nobody appeared to be in the room, so I continued walking out the door. "Who?" I asked, and she let out a harsh wheeze between every word. "The man who started the fire." I looked back since the girl was pointing at her bedroom door and watched as the hacked door closed, but not before getting a glimpse at a man with orange skin and a wide grin. He slightly chuckled while moving out of my sight. When I was a homicide detective in New York, I got assigned a big case which changed my life and career forever. The murder made the headlines several times over, featuring me as the lead detective. You know, the star of the show, chasing down a serial killer that everyone called Jack the Second Ripper, or Jack 2.0 for short. The killer only went after women and savagely cut them up before leaving the bodies strewn over a few blocks. Now, I still have night terrors of those women's mutilated faces, and the case was never solved, and in total, 23 young women lost their lives. Now, not only was it frustrating to see the case go cold after several years, but the more I and the other detectives learned about the murders, the more we didn't understand. The killer left behind no traces of DNA anywhere, no cameras ever caught the events, and no sort of fingerprints or shoe marks. I've mulled over the evidence in the crime scenes in my head for many years, and I've never found a slip-up on either side. I don't think our killer was human. There are two situations which make me think this way. The first was murder number 20, Sydney Longfellow, which happened during our investigations. The young woman must have known she was in danger because we found her in her parents' safe room in her penthouse. The computer showed the door locked and remained locked until her parents opened it with the code and found her. No signs of forced entry. By the way, I'm not using real names here. And now the second situation was just after the final two murders. We'd come to the body just minutes after her death, and the witness who called it in claimed that the attackers skirted up a wall and entered a building by smashing through a window. We entered the apartment complex and went to apartment 308. The door was locked. We knocked, but we didn't get an answer. The sound came from inside, so we waited for some patrolmen to return with a battering ram and bash the door in. The apartment was dark, and we entered cautiously with pistols held high. I entered one of the bedrooms and noticed the figure. It was tattered black robes, standing over a body, raking at the victim's face with clawed fingernails. And I'm still not sure to this day, but I believe the figure was eating the torn off flesh. I held my gun up to the thing, but as I did so, I adjusted my footing, and it made a little noise, and the figure leapt through the nearest window. And when I checked out the window, I couldn't find it. No sign of a fall, and no one else on the fire escapes or climbing up. I couldn't find anyone with a profile nearby. And that was the last murder which resembled the killer. We never found the son of a bitch. Either human insanity has no end, or it had to have been something other than human. I used to be a paramedic for a local fire department, but I had an unusual call which actually made me take a career change into the military. It was on Halloween night, nearing midnight, and the alarm went off. We raced off as usual and made it to the house where a young lady told us her grandmother was convulsing on her bedroom floor. The other paramedic and I dashed into the room to find the grandmother shaking on the floor with foam coming from her mouth. I bent down to start checking her vitals, and we put her into the proper position. And then the old woman stopped her shaking and jerked her head towards me. "He's in my closet," she whispered to me, and I asked her, "Who?" And she responded, "The devil." And I glanced over to her closet, which had slats, and I could see a pair of eyes glistening between them. And instantly, chills went down my spine, and for a moment made my toes numb. And now at that time, the ambulance had shown up, and a few people brought in a stretcher, which they heaved the old woman onto. When they took her from the room, I looked back to the closet, and still the eyes shined, and I took a cautious step towards it. The other paramedic entered the room just as I placed my hand onto the knob of the closet. My hand burned at the touch of the metal knob, and so I used part of my shirt to open the closet quickly, but nothing was on the other side, especially nothing which resembled a pair of eyes. And when I checked my palm, there wasn't a burn mark or even any pain. My oddest tale on the job was when I received a ping to check out a noise complaint. I went into it thinking everything would be normal. Maybe a couple of loud teenagers we'd get to scare. But it was only the start of strange events. When we arrived to the call, we met with the neighbor who called in the complaint. He told us that loud yelling had been coming from the basement since the sun rose hours prior. We approached the house and could hear the screaming for ourselves. It was definitely a shout of distress. We banged on the door for a moment, and after getting no response, we walked around the property. My partner found a low window where the shouting was coming from, but we couldn't see anyone in there. The window wasn't locked, so we slid it down and asked what the trouble was. A woman's voice returned saying that she needed help. And at that time, my partner found that one of the doors was open, and we went into the basement. A young woman in her mid-20s had been chained to a wall inside a glass box. However, the door to the glass box was open. "I need help. They're gone." She fell to her knees in tears. "They're gone. The shadows are gone." We weren't sure what she was talking about. Maybe some sort of Stockholm syndrome. So we called in a bus and began unchaining her from the wall. And the entire time, she kept telling us that the shadows were gone and that they wouldn't return for her. They didn't need her anymore. And she never told us of her captor or captors. But the strangest thing was that the house was foreclosed. The neighbors didn't know anyone was living there, even though the inside was fully furnished. She'd been admitted to an institution, and when my partner and I went to go check on her, we were told that she had committed suicide. But I still wonder all the time, what were the shadows? As a state trooper, I've seen a lot of accidents and a lot of bogus, dumb, or completely odd excuses which accompany them. One time, I got a call that a man had flipped his truck, so I went to investigate. He'd been the only vehicle involved, and it wasn't icy. It was a middle-aged man, and he wasn't intoxicated or on any drugs that I could tell. He did seem confused. So, I asked him the story, and he told me that he'd been driving at a normal speed when a strange animal walked in front of his truck. He said that it resembled a gorilla, and I knew he wanted to say it, that it was like Bigfoot, but he refrained. He tried to swerve out of the way of this gorilla, but it leapt at him and hit the driver's side door. I was beginning to think the man was crazy, but then we walked down to inspect his truck, which lay on its side, and I jumped up and looked at the door. And by God, there were handprints in the blue crumbled metal. thumbs and all, and much larger than my own hand size. I was astonished, and we tried both looking around for footprints, but never found any. Only pieces of the truck which had been flung from the roll. I took pictures and I've asked experts, and I've gotten every possible idea under the sun on what caused those handprints. I was just about to start my break and grab myself a warm coffee, but then I got a call that a little girl dialed 911 and said that she was stuck in the floorboards of her home. Now, it seemed unusual, but it seemed an easy call, which I was told to stick to since my partner had called out sick that day. I arrived at the house and walked up the front steps. It was snowing a little bit, covering what already layered the ground. My knocks went unanswered, and I looked into the windows. The entire house was dark and empty. So confused, I returned to the car and called dispatch asking if they were able to get the girl on the phone again. They tried and she answered, only saying that she was stuck and afraid, that the floorboards weren't moving. I kicked the door and then searched the house, calling out for the little girl. And I heard some thudding coming from a bedroom. And all I could think about was the story I'd read in high school, the telltale heart, with the heart beating in the floor. But I assumed it was someone banging on the wood. I found the spot in the floor which was the cause of the thumping, and I knocked back on the floor and received a knock back. So I ran back out to my car and grabbed my crowbar. The family would be mad at me, but shame on them for leaving a child alone who could crawl into a crawl space and get stuck. I used the crowbar lightly and wedged it between the hardwood floor. I didn't want to push it down too hard and hurt the child by accident. And when I pried it all off, I stared in amazement. There was no crawl space or anywhere for a child to hide. So I called out for the little girl, and I didn't hear any banging. When I returned to my car and asked if dispatch would call the girl back, they told me that the phone line kept ringing. The family returned home shortly after, and I explained the whole situation to them, and I told them how to file a complaint in order to get their floor fixed again.